Good morning, Kings Cross from the Olive Family 2.0. We're excited to worship with you today.
Happy Sunday, Kings Cross. I miss seeing everybody. We love you. God bless all of you.
And don't forget Mother's Day this weekend.
Good morning, Kings Cross.
Good morning. We're the Dillahays, and we're making it through the COVID-19 crisis, and we hope you're doing well also.
We hope to see you all real soon.
Bye.
Good morning, Kings Cross. I hope everyone is doing well. Looking forward to seeing you soon when we resume our services. God bless you. Take care.
Happy Sunday, Kings Cross.
Good morning, Kings Cross. I miss you.
Happy Sunday, Kings Cross.
Hello, Kings Cross. Good morning. Happy Sunday.
Good morning, Kings Cross Church.
Good morning, Kings Cross. We love you and miss you.
Hey everybody, Pastor Scott here, and welcome to Virtual Worship for Sunday, May 17th. I'm so glad that you found us and that you're joining us. We are in our third week of our study of Jonah, A Holy Reluctance, and I am back in our worship center. I'm so excited for us to be recording our virtual worship here in person. We're not yet back just yet to in-person worship, so don't worry, you're not missing out. I'm here alone right now, but we are well on our way to returning back to a lot of in-person gatherings and worship in the days and weeks to come. So we'll have more information for you about that very soon, but just know that we continue to make progress in our in-person gatherings, and I couldn't be more excited to be worshiping back here in our sanctuary, and looking forward to being back here with you very, very soon. If you haven't yet, make sure that you found us online on social media, that you've signed up for Casey Online, our church portal, where you can get more information from me on a weekly basis, sometimes multiple times a week, as well as great information about ministry opportunities in the life of our church. It's a great way to stay connected and to get the latest information as soon as possible about all the great developments going on in the life of our church. Finally, let me also offer a word of thanks to those of you that continue to give so faithfully during this time of separation and distance. It means the world to me and makes a world of difference. Not only does it allow us to do a lot of this great virtual work that our staff is producing on a regular, daily, weekly basis, but it also lays the foundation for our return back to in-person worship, study, ministry, and is going to allow us in the future to maintain a foot in both worlds. The digital world for folks that may not be able to join us right away as we come back from this time of distancing, as well as our in-person worship and ministry. We want to continue to do all of that with excellence as we live into our sense of mission to embrace brokenness and champion wholeness in and through Jesus Christ. So thank you for those gifts. If you're ready to join us in partnering with us in ministry and making those gifts, there are three great ways for you to give right now. One is online, www.kcc.church/give through our online giving portal. The second is through your bank's online bill pay. The third is through the mail, and you can see the address there on the screen. Thank you again for those gifts and being willing to partner with us in ministry. We can't wait to be back here in this room together soon. I hope you're doing well, and I'm so glad that you're here for worship. Let's continue in worship now.
Before I spoke a word, you were singing over me. And you have been so, so good to me. Before I took a breath, you breathed your life in me. You have been so, so kind to me. And oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. And oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. And I couldn't earn it, and I don't deserve. Still you give was your foe, still your love fought for me. You have been so, so good to me. When I felt no worth, you paid it all for me. Yes, you did, Lord. You have been so, so kind to me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. And oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. And I couldn't earn, and I don't deserve. Still you give yourself away. And oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Yeah. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. No shadow, there's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow there. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. Oh, there's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. For oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. And oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. And I couldn't earn, and I don't deserve. Still you give yourself away. And oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Yeah. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. And oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. And I couldn't earn, and I don't deserve. Still you give yourself away. And oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God.
I am weary from the way, crashing over every day. God of mercy, please come and rescue me. I am longing for your voice, gentle whisper in the noise. Father, tell me everything's alright. Your power, your presence breaks strongholds. King of heaven, when you speak, mountains move, and I believe there will be breakthrough. I know there will be breakthrough. You alone can take my scars, piece by piece restore my heart. Take what's broken and make it whole again. Your power, your presence breaks strongholds. King of heaven, when you speak, mountains move. I believe there will be breakthrough. Your power, your presence breaks strongholds. King of heaven, when you speak, mountains move. I believe there will be breakthrough. There will be breakthrough. There will be breakthrough. There will be breakthrough. Shake the mountain, break the walls apart, open the heavens. Almighty God, you are overcomer, defender of my heart. It's by your power, Lord. And by your power, these oceans open wide. Fire fall down, heaven and earth collide. King Jesus, forever by my side. Shake the mountains, yeah. Shake the mountains, break the walls apart, open the heavens. Almighty God, you are
King of heaven, when you speak, mountains move, and I believe there will be breakthrough. There will be breakthrough. Yes, Lord. There will be breakthrough. There's a grace and the heart is under fire. Another way when the walls are closing in. And when I look at the space between where I used to be and this reckoning, and I know I'll never be alone. There was another in the fire standing next to me. There was another in the waters, holding back the seas. And should I ever need reminding how I'm set free, there is a cross that bears a burden where another died for me. There is another in the fire. All my dead life ever need the waters. I'm no longer a slave to my sin anymore. Should I fall in the space between what remains of me and this reckoning? And I know I'll never be alone, 'cause I know I will never be alone. There is another in the fight, standing next to me. There is another in the waters, holding back the seas. And should I ever need reminding, will power set me free? There is a grave that holds nobody, and now that power lives in me. There is another in the fire. Oh, 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 and I can see the light in the darkness as the darkness bounds to him. I can hear the roar in the heavens as the space between rests thin. I can feel the ground shake beneath us as the prison walls cave in. Nothing stands between us. Nothing stands between us. There is no other name but the name that is Jesus. He who was and still is and will be through it all. So come what may in the space between all the things I'm seeing and this reckoning. And I know I will never be alone, 'cause I know. And I know I will never be alone.
So here we are today at one of both the most well-known and least known parts of Jonah. So we're getting to, of course, the belly of the fish today. And I'm really excited about it because, one, it's a place of familiarity, but also it's a place of deep introspection, deep exploration of Jonah, his character, his heart, and what seems to be motivating him and what seems to be motivating his reluctance. So we'll be in chapter 2 today. We'll start in 1:17 and then go through 2 verse 10, which really follows Jonah to his lowest point, literally and probably spiritually, though he never quite gets over this reluctance. So as you're turning there, if you want to turn or swipe on over to Jonah 1:17, while you're doing that, let me give, again, just a brief refresher on where we are in this broad story. Up to this point, we know that God has found Jonah seemingly going about his normal life, his everyday life, and given him a call to go and preach to Nineveh. Now, Nineveh is a prominent city in the Assyrian Empire, one of the worst, most terrible enemies of the northern kingdom of Israel, of Jonah's people. And so Jonah's response isn't too surprising. He hears the news and he hightails it out of there. Not only does he head the opposite direction of Nineveh, he heads as far as he can think. He purchases a ticket to go as far away in the opposite direction of Nineveh and presumably God as he can. So he leaves where he is, heads down to Joppa to catch a ship, which then goes on to Tarshish, the end of the known world at that time. And as he's doing that, as he's going on this journey, God catches up with him, throws a great big storm onto the Mediterranean Sea, and the sailors that are piloting the ship, of course, are confused, concerned. They're praying to all their known gods that they can. And Jonah, where is he? He's down in the belly of the ship, asleep. So he's woken up. They eventually decide that he's the source of their problem. He's the source of their danger. And they're still reluctant to do anything about it. Jonah says, "Throw me over." And they say, "No way. Your God would be too angry at us for that." And he says, "Don't worry about it." So finally he convinces them to pitch him over the side. So what we see here is that, as we talked about last week, there is an important symbolic relationship in the book of Jonah to direction. That particularly in the broad Old Testament, but in Jonah too, that there's a sense that heading up is heading towards God, while heading down is heading away from God. So we can go back, right? Jonah heads down from where he hears the call of God to Joppa. He gets on a ship and he goes down into the ship. And then, just as God hurls a storm onto the sea, Jonah 1 tells us, the sailors have now hurled him into the sea, all because Jonah doesn't want any part of what God is doing or calling him to do. There's a suspicion, there's a part, right, that Jonah knows more of what God is at work, what God is about. He knows that he really doesn't want to be a part of this preaching, this teaching that God has called him to do. And we'll see more about that, not only today, but in the weeks ahead. Spoiler alert, Jonah goes and preaches half-heartedly. The Ninevites respond, and the grace of God comes to them. And Jonah's pretty upset about it. So we're going to talk about why is that? Why is Jonah, and by extension, why are we so often reluctant, resistant to the grace of God when it comes to those that we don't like? Well, today, as Jonah sits for 3 days in the belly of a fish, we get a glimpse as to what's going on in the heart and mind of Jonah. So I'm excited to look at that with you. So that's our context. That's what's going on. Those are the dynamics at play in Jonah's story. So let's jump in, dive in, right? I've got lots of good puns for this one, right? Let's dive in, take a look at this gut punch that Jonah finds in the belly of the whale. I'll start for us in Jonah 1:17 and go all the way through chapter 2, which is 10 verses, all right? Let's take a look. It says, "Now the Lord had arranged for a great fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from inside the fish. He said, I cried out to the Lord in my great trouble, and he answered me. I called to you from the land of the dead, and Lord, you heard me. You threw me into the ocean depths, and I sank down to the heart of the sea. The mighty waters engulfed me. I was buried beneath your wild and stormy waves. Then I said, O Lord, you have driven me from your presence. Yet I will look once more toward your holy temple. I sink beneath the waves, and the waters closed over me. Seaweed wrapped itself around my head. I sank down to the very roots of the mountains. I was imprisoned in the earth, whose gates lock shut forever. But you, O Lord my God, snatched me from the jaws of death. As my life was slipping away, I remembered the Lord, and my earnest prayer went out to you in your holy temple. Those who worship false gods turn their backs on all God's mercies. But I will offer sacrifices to you with songs of praise, and I will fulfill all my vows, for my salvation comes from the Lord alone. Then the Lord ordered the fish to spit Jonah out onto the beach. Well, there's a few things I think for us to notice with really broad brushstrokes, right? A few key elements, key details I want us to notice, to take note of before we go forward. And then I really want to dive in with Jonah and explore what's going on. I think for us, this is one of the most extended portions of Jonah's own speech, of Jonah's reflection and expression of his heart and his spirituality. And it tells us some interesting things, both about what's there and what's not there. But first, before we do that, a couple broad observations, right? Now, depending on your translation, you may notice a key difference, a key detail, that in the Hebrew and in many of our translations today, the story is not a whale, but a fish. It's simply a large fish, and that's true in the Hebrew. Now, for a long, long time, particularly in the ancient world, the Greek version of the Old Testament, called the Septuagint, translated that word from Hebrew to Greek not as large fish, but specifically as a whale. Very well could have been a whale, or the author intended to communicate a whale, but they do say fish. So if that caught your eye, your attention, you say, wait a minute, I was expecting a whale to be here. Technically in the text, it says a large fish. So it could have been a whale, or it could have been who knows what. But that's what's going on with the language there. Now also, if you're like me, you would have preferred there to be a footnote or maybe an appendix on the end. So how did this work? Tell me more about this whale. Tell me how Jonah gets in there, how Jonah survives, how Jonah gets out, right? But in terms of the story, the author of the book of Jonah's not too interested in those details. Rather, the fish provides the context. It provides this place of self-reflection and exploration and prayer. It's in this belly, very close to this sense of in this womb, that Jonah is carried, he's conveyed to the place of God's call before he's spit up or spit out again. It's kind of an interesting context for this spiritual work to happen. Now, there's a couple broad observations I want to encourage you with as you think about this part of the story. The first is Jonah is literally at his lowest. He has gone down as far as you can go. Down, he says, into the depths to where the roots of the mountains lie. And there, God still found me. So maybe today you just need to be reminded that there is no depth too far, no darkness too dark, no place beyond the reach of God's provision. Even there, at the bottom of the sea, God found a way to provide for and protect Jonah and to reconnect Jonah, even in the midst of his reluctance, to the call and mission of God. That's encouraging for me, right? Even if I'm consciously resisting, much less the times where I'm unconsciously resisting the work of God in the world. There's no place I can go. There's no way that I can mess it up too badly that is beyond God's redemptive work and God's ability to bring me back into the mission and redemption of God. That's awesome. There's also, I think, kind of an important observation, which is sometimes, particularly when we run away, particularly when we resist, particularly when we cast ourselves into the deep and require something as miraculous as a fish to get us there, sometimes that transition from going down away from God to going back up towards God, sometimes that transition and that process can be kind of gross. It can be kind of yucky. He literally gets spit up. He gets thrown up onto the shore, which is where we leave it today, and we'll pick up next week as he enters into his calling to preach to the Ninevites, right? That's what we're on the cusp of, the second half of Jonah's story starting next week. But this sense of going from our resistance to God to our, in Jonah's case, begrudging compliance to what God is doing, while it can happen, while God's redemptive work will get us there, it doesn't mean it's always clean, easy, or enjoyable, right? There's some consequence to our decisions in the midst of that. I think that's worth noting too, right? We got to have both sides of the coin. But that's one encouragement I want to offer you today, that wherever you are, whatever you've done, whatever sits in your past, nothing is beyond the redemptive work of God and the willingness of God to connect you back with the calling, the mission, the ministry that he's placed on your life. Now, that's the big, broad brushstrokes, right? What I'm really interested in, what's really stood out to me this week, are these verses, these prayers that begin for Jonah with a quotation or an adaptation of a psalm there in verses 1 and 2, which is a kind of a repackaging of Psalm 18. I think this is very interesting because here he is as a prophet, as a man of God, called by God, again, as we've talked about before, fully aware, fully educated in the ways of God, in the language of God, in the scriptures even of God. And his reluctance remains. And so I think there's something, as Jonah prays in the belly of the whale, the lowest of the lows for him, we catch a glimpse of what's going on. And I think we also are invited to consider our own reluctance and how it relates to the redemptive work of forgiveness that God is doing in the world. Because if we're honest with ourselves, truly honest, if I'm honest with myself, there's some times, in some places, in some situations, where I'm not too keen on God's gospel of grace, right? I think we can all relate to that in a way. So here's a couple observations. If your Bible is like mine, it's got most of chapter 2 offset. It looks like a psalm, right? Because Jonah is quoting both Psalm 18 at the beginning and makes some allusion to, some quotation to Psalm 3 and Psalm 16 at the end. But what's in between is really a prayer of Jonah's heart. And what we begin to see is that all is not well in Jonah's heart. Now, I think if we were to count, I've seen one count that says that there are 26 uses of the first person just in chapter 2 alone, just in these 10 verses. But all of them are rather positive, even proud uses of the I. What we might expect at this time, if Jonah is going to turn to the Psalms, would be Psalms of repentance, Psalms of forgiveness. But instead what we find is it takes the shape of a psalm of thanksgiving, that in Jonah's mind, there's no doubt that he would be saved. There's no doubt that God's grace is going to carry him and convey him forward. So it's a psalm of thanksgiving instead. So we're kind of impressed. I'm struck by Jonah's assurance of the goodness of God. But also, if we look more closely, there's a hint of pride. There's a hint of presumption or assumption that Jonah has perhaps earned this salvation, that while it comes at God's hand, he at least is better than those Ninevites. He at least has tried to live well, to be well, to do good in the world. And we see this most prominently there at the end. It looks as if we may make it through these prayers of thanksgiving without really kind of any mention of what's going on until we get to verses 8 and 9. Take a look with me again at that, where Jonah says, I'll back us up to 7. He says, "As my life was slipping away, I remembered the Lord, and my earnest prayer went out to you and your holy temple. Those who worship false gods turn their backs on all God's mercies. But I will offer sacrifices to you with songs of praise, and I will fulfill all my vows, for my salvation comes from the Lord alone." It's like he couldn't quite resist. He couldn't stop himself from alluding to the Ninevites. Now, there's a certain part here that's not lost on me. I don't think it should be lost on us, that God has not excused what the Ninevites, what the Assyrians have done. He's not once looked at Jonah and said, this resistance, this reluctance that you have, this defiance, perhaps even hatred of the Ninevites. He never says it's totally misplaced. He never says, oh, what they did to you, what they did to your people isn't that bad. He never looks at Jonah and says, Jonah, get over it. Really what we've seen so far is that as Jonah's reluctance has pushed him, caused him to run farther from God, God has simply pursued him in the midst of it. But Jonah here can't help himself from alluding to the fact those who worship false gods, those Ninevites, they've turned their backs on all of God's mercies. But I will offer sacrifices to you. I will fulfill my vows. My salvation will come from the Lord. There's this sense a little bit of that transactional grace, of this sense that Jonah is saying, well, I've done what's right and received mercy. How can those people that have done wrong receive mercy? We get this wonderful window into the reluctance of Jonah. And yet, it doesn't change the fact that God's plan is to still preach to the Ninevites, to still offer grace, to still work, as we talked about last week, to fulfill the covenant he made with Abraham all the way back in Genesis, that through the people of God, all nations will be blessed. Not just those that earn it, not just those that deserve it, not just those that keep the covenant, but all people in all nations will be blessed. And Jonah resists that. One of the big questions, I think, for us that Jonah invites us to here at the low point, beginning next week in the second half of Jonah, we'll travel with Jonah back up towards God, towards the call of God, the mission of God, the mission to redeem the Ninevites, to provide grace for them. But right now, here at the low point, here in the belly of the whale, the belly of the fish that's swimming towards Nineveh, back to where Jonah's been called, we're invited to reflect, to ponder, to consider, I think, one big question. And that question is, who are we in the story? Who are we in the story? I told this to you once before. It's one of my favorite memories. I was laughing about it not long ago between my dad and I. And I told you in the past that I'm a big history person. I love history, love reading biography, political history, those kinds of things. I'm reading Team of Rivals about Abraham Lincoln. I'm rereading that right now. One of my favorite memories with my dad is that years ago I was home from college and I was reading Founding Brothers by Joseph J. Ellis. It's a pretty short book, but it looks at kind of some of the personal / political relationships between the founding fathers. It won a Pulitzer, I think, 15 years ago or so, something like that. And I'd finished the book. I'd come down for lunch. My dad was in the kitchen, and I was just kind of going on, talking to him, talking to anybody that would listen about how, oh man, how cool would it have been to have lived during the Revolutionary War, to be a part of that, to be a part of that generation, that fraternity of people trying to bring about freedom in America. And it's going on and on and on about this, about how what I would have done and who I would have been friends with and connected with, kind of imagining myself in the story of the founding brothers, the founding fathers. And my dad's standing there making lunch in the kitchen. And finally, when I pause long enough to take a breath, he kind of looks up at me, says, I don't think so. I think you would have been a Tory. It goes back to making his lunch. I'm offended. How dare you? How dare you assume that not only would I not have been one of the leaders of the group, right, bringing about change, advocating liberty, those kinds of things, but he says, you would have been a loyalist. You would have stuck with the British. You would have been on the other side, right? In a way that only dads can, right? He kind of reminded me of my place a bit in the midst of that. And I love that story because he very well could have been right, as much as I may like to dispute it or dream otherwise. But it's always stuck with me. That's a great reminder, I think, particularly when we come to Scripture, to remember that oftentimes we want to view ourselves as the hero, whoever we think the hero may be. That's one of the attractions of superhero movies, or science fiction movies, or really any kind of book or movie or story, TV show, is we form that connection with the hero. But the truth of the matter is, quite often, we may not be the hero. The majority of us could fit with or connect with someone else. Maybe not the hero, maybe not the villain, but maybe somewhere in between. And so I think one of the invitations of Jonah's story at this point is to ask ourselves, who in the story do we connect with? Are we Jonah? Are we the people who do everything right and who deserve this grace and salvation that we experience? Or are we the Ninevites? Are we people who are desperate to receive grace, who need grace, who just need someone to extend grace to them? I think that's a great question for us to consider. Likewise, I think it's worth us considering that even if we're somebody like Jonah, right? If we, because we are people that know God, we know God's story, we know the roadmap to grace, to God's grace, we have to be careful that we don't think too highly of ourselves in that way. Because what we see happening here is Jonah in his mind is crafting or maybe revealing an important distinction. He's viewing the Ninevites as enemy, as other. He's creating this duality or this binary that he, and maybe by extension the people of God, are one way and they are another. But the beauty of Jonah's story is already in chapter 1, we've seen that it's the person of God, the called one of God in Jonah, who seems to be ignoring God. And it's the sailors, the pagan sailors who know nothing of Yahweh, who are so receptive, so open to the grace and goodness of God, that it confuses our categories. It's not that clear cut. And so I think there's a wonderful opportunity for us to consider, who are we in the story? And if we really look closely enough, whether we are more like Jonah or more like the Ninevites or more like the sailors, or who knows, maybe I connect with the large fish, right, that's just swimming around and having to do things you don't want to do, right? That it's more complicated. It's life and God's redemptive work resists those categories, which is why, if we fast forward to the New Testament, we see a real reluctance by Jesus and Paul, early church leaders. There's a real resistance, pushback against that dual thinking, that duality of inside and outside, right, wrong, good, bad. Jesus, Paul, others, they say, we don't want any part of that. That's not the way forward. That's not the way of God. Let me give you a couple of examples real quick. I wrote down just a few, right? Paul in Romans 12, 17 through 19 famously says, never pay back evil with more evil. Do things in such a way that everyone can see you are honorable. Do all that you can to live in peace with everyone. Dear friends, never take revenge. He goes on in Ephesians 4:32 to say, instead be kind to each other, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, just as God through Christ has forgiven you. Peter in 1 Peter 3:8 says, finally, all of you should be of one mind, sympathize with each other, love each other as brothers and sisters, be tender-hearted, and keep a humble attitude. We can go back to John 13, where Jesus says, the world will know that you follow me by the way that you love others, by the way that you pursue unity, that you resist division. And I think this is a critical insight that goes back to Jonah and before. There's a recognition that part of our brokenness, part of our sin in the world is our desire, our predisposition to separate the world into those that are like us, generally good, right? And those that are not like us, generally bad. But instead, the reality is the message of Jonah, what we will find is that the grace of God is universal to all, just as our need for the grace of God is universal to all. And so I think that's why so often we find some of the worst violence, some of the greatest vitriol in the world falls in moments when there is a sharp duality. Think about that. That often the places that are most in tension, where there's the greatest level of animosity, are when the world is divided into two opposite halves, right? Think about it. Could be in terms of politics, red and blue. Could be in terms of good and bad. It could be in terms of race. It could be in terms of gender. It could be in terms of so much that when we, in our brokenness, want to reduce the world into opposing categories, we so often put ourselves in opposition to the redemptive, healing, unifying work of God. Now, as we'll find, as we'll see, there's some nuance to this. We have to be careful with this. It doesn't mean that at times bad things are not bad things, that wrong things are not wrong. As we'll find in Jonah's story, the Ninevites must still repent, that they've done wicked, terrible, horrible things. But the grace of God, that's what unifies all of us. That's what's relevant for all of us. That's what's common to all of us. And it's what binds us together. That's where the old hymn goes, they will know we are Christians by our love. And what does Paul tell us in Ephesians 4? That instead we should be kind to each other, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, just as God through Christ has forgiven you. In Jonah 2, verse 9, there's the phrase in the Hebrew, 2 words, where it talks about my salvation comes from the Lord alone. It's kind of an expansion of a phrase there, but they're 2 words right next to each other of Yeshuata Yahweh, deliverer or delivering God. But did you hear that? Did you catch that Hebrew phrase? Yeshuata. Yeshua. Jesus. That we see God is Jesus in us. Jonah acknowledges that God is redeeming us, restoring us through Jesus. And so we are called, Paul takes that the next step, we are called to forgive one another. Jonah is called to forgive, to preach a message, to open the pathway, to share the roadmap to grace. The only way that's possible, the only way Paul can, in good conscience, ask us to be tender-hearted, forgiving one another, is because Christ has already forgiven us. Instead, be kind, tender-hearted, forgiving each other, just as God through Christ, through Yeshua, has forgiven you. What a great invitation, what a great challenge for us. So that's my invitation for you this week. Is just like Jonah has had to spend 3 days meditating on his own journey. meditating on the reluctance and the tension within him. So I think we too should spend this next week meditating on our own reluctance, right? What are those places? What are those relationships where there's been a rupture, where there's been a breach? Perhaps rightfully so. Perhaps there's been real harm. Perhaps there's been real damage, real issues at place. But is it a place where the forgiveness of God still has room, still has an opportunity? Is there a place in your life where perhaps you, like Jonah, have truly been wronged? And God is encouraging you, prompting you to bring forgiveness to bear, or to point that individual or that person or that place, to point them towards God and forgiveness. Or perhaps, again, you may find yourself in other parts of life where you're like the Ninevites, where you're in desperate need of forgiveness, and you're trying to find the way towards that. I think my invitation, or our invitation, is this. This is your action step for the next week, is take some time like Jonah. Take some time to spend this week in the belly of a fish, contemplating on not only the grace of God, but also God's desire to bring that grace to others. I think as we see with the Ninevites, it never excuses, right? God never diminishes what's happened to Jonah, never diminishes what's happened to the northern kingdom, never excuses what the Ninevites have done. Wrong is wrong, right? Wrong is wrong. And yet, as Jonah himself experiences, there's no depth too far, no darkness too dark, that the redeeming act, the redeeming love of God can't take root. And so we have to hold those places in tension. So that's my invitation. That's my challenge for you this week, is take time and examine your life, examine your relationships, and pray, ask God, where are you calling me to point the way towards forgiveness? Where are you inviting me to do the hard work of asking for forgiveness, of offering forgiveness, of pointing the way towards you? Where do I desire there to be vengeance and punishment? And perhaps you, Lord, desire grace and mercy. Where are those places? What's holding me back? What's causing me in my anger and resistance to miss out on what you're calling me to do in life? Start there and hold on to that, because it's from this place of the lowest depths, it's from this place of the belly of the whale that God delivers Jonah and begins a conversation. This doesn't heal completely, doesn't eradicate, doesn't change Jonah's reluctance, but it carries us forward into this next phase of the story beginning next week, where we see God as the King of grace, the owner of grace, the one who offers it to all. And we have to wrestle with that fact, that not only does grace belong to us, but it belongs to others too. And it's in that grace that the world is no longer divided into inside and outside, people like me and people like them, but instead it's in the midst of God's grace that the kingdom of God, the us of God, is developed. It's hard, it's difficult, it's messy, and we'll talk more about how that looks and how that can be in the weeks ahead. But let me invite you to join me in pondering with Jonah, who are we in the story, and who is God calling us to be in the days ahead? Let's continue in worship.
Grand earth has quaked before, moved by the sound of his voice. waves and wind still know His name. So let go, my soul, and trust in Him. The waves and wind still know His name. So let go, my soul, and trust in Him. The waves and wind still know His name. The waves and wind still know His name. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well, it is well with my soul. 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 It is well, it is well with my soul. And through it all, my eyes are on you. And through it all, it is well, Lord. And through it all, my eyes are on you. And it is well with me.
Well, that brings us to the end of this week's virtual worship. I'm so glad that you could be here and be a part of our worship. I'm looking forward to gathering together with you in person very soon in the coming weeks. We'll have more details about all those plans in the coming days and weeks. Just know that I can't wait to see you up close and in person. As you get ready to go this week, I know while it's a simple ask, it's actually a very difficult ask. I'm asking you to sit with Jonah. I'm asking for us as a faith family to sit with Jonah and take the time to examine our hearts. What are those places of pain? What are those places where God's grace needs to take root? Where are those places, consciously or unconsciously, we find ourselves dividing the world into that duality? Those inside and outside, those like us and not like us, the good, the bad, the right, the wrong. What are those places? And what is God calling us to do instead? As you get ready to go this weekend to do that hard work, and I'll be the first to tell you, it's hard work, but it's good, worthy work. As you get ready to go and do that hard work this week, let me offer you just these 2 verses of encouragement from Peter in 1 Peter 3, 8 through 9. He says, "Finally, all of you should be of one mind. Sympathize with each other, love each other as brothers and sisters. Be tender-hearted and keep a humble attitude. Don't repay evil for evil. Don't retaliate with insults when people insult you. Instead, pay them back with a blessing. That is what God has called you to do, and he will grant you his blessing." That's my prayer for you this week, that you and I, that we can do the hard work of exploring our inner life, those places of division, those places of reluctance, that we may invite God into that process. Know that we love you, we miss you, that we are for you, and can't wait to gather with you again soon. Go in peace, go in grace, go in knowing that Yeshua, Jesus, our deliverer, is working to unify this world in grace and love. Have a great week. Amen.